If you want to hear new episodes of the show 1 week early, plus bonus episodes and unlimited access to more of Texas Monthly's reporting and commentary on the state, subscribe to Texas Monthly at texasmonthly.com/audio. You can find that link in the show notes for this episode.
Texas Monthly.
Hey, and welcome to another episode of Viva Tejano, a Texas Monthly podcast about Tejano music told by the people who make it and live it. I'm your host, JB Sauceda. This week, I sat down with Congressman Joaquin Castro. Joaquin Castro has represented Texas's 20th congressional district in San Antonio since 2013. He grew up on the west side of San Antonio in a household that was both steeped in the Chicano movement and filled with a soundtrack full of Tejano music. Freddie Fender, Emilio, and Selena were all mixed in with 80s pop stars and folk singers with less well-known Mexican roots like Linda Ronstadt and Joan Baez. Today, he's on a mission to make sure the whole country understands that Latino and Hispanic music is American music. He's been working to get Latino artists, including Tejano musicians, added to the National Recording Registry at the Library of Congress. As you'll hear him explain, helping more people appreciate the nation's Hispanic heritage is, the way he sees it, truly a life and death issue. All right, here's Congressman Joaquin Castro. I appreciate you taking the time. You know, your name came up for a ton of reasons, but I think one of the biggest ones was in part because you honored Johnny Canales on the House floor shortly after he passed away. And so I'd love to kick things off with talking about him and his music and his show and your relationship with it.
Johnny Canales was a pioneer, and he was the person that really brought a lot of Tejano music, especially that golden era of Tejano music. Yeah, for me, it was like late 80s to mid 90s into people's households. And I was growing up in San Antonio, and my grandmother was still alive with us back then. I lived mostly with my mom and my grandmother, and she would often have his show on. And so, we were listening to the songs as she was listening to them, and it was just I just have great memories of watching his show and watching these acts come on. And, it wasn't really until later that I really appreciated his full effect, like what he did, because Tejano music was uniquely Mexican-American music, of course, originating in Texas. And my grandmother, who had come here as an immigrant from Mexico, from Coahuila in 1922, she was kind of living in between two worlds. She used to watch these Cantinflas movies, and she'd listen to like Pedro Infante. And then she'd also on the weekend listen to Lawrence Welk, the big band orchestra, and my mom, kind of a similar thing, but she was listening to the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and then Linda Ronstadt and Joan Baez and a lot of these Mexican-American or Latina singers who had changed their names, folks like Freddie Fender. And so for my generation now, I feel like this was the fusion of a lot of that in Tejano music. And it was a special time and distinctly Tejano.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to honor Juan Jose Johnny Canales, a legend of Tejano music who died on Thursday at the age of 77. Johnny was a champion for civil rights, an advocate for veterans, and a musician in his own right, but he was best known as the host of the Johnny Canales Show, a bilingual variety show that ran for decades in the United States and Latin America. Johnny, you will always be remembered, especially among your loyal fans in South Texas. Que descanse en paz, Johnny. Rest in peace.
Everybody has a different kind of take on what in their childhood Tejano was. For me at home, it was Friday nights at my aunt and uncle's house. I was talking to a few other people here recently on the show, and they talked about when the Tejano came on, it was like, it's time to clean the house, So when Tejano was played, like, was there a specific reason, or was it just kind of background music to the Castro family in general?
Well, in the house, it was my grandmother listening to it, but also, it was just all around. It was when we would go to backyard birthday parties for my cousins. It was quinceañeras. My parents and then my dad and my stepmom later on used to hang out at a few bars in San Antonio on the west side the Round Table and the Fountain Room. And you'd go in there and somebody would be putting on Emilio Navaira, Selena, David Lee Garza, La Tropa F, all of these different bands. And so I feel like it was all around me. And then, of course, as a child of the 80s, I was listening to also Michael Jackson and Madonna and Cyndi Lauper and Prince, all of these like popular music acts in the country. But I always felt like that Tejano music was something special to our community that also in a way I feel like kept me grounded, particularly in those years when I was gone. I was gone to college in California. And, it was during that time, for example, that Selena was murdered in 1995. I think I was back for spring break around that time in 95. And so to me, like forever in my mind, it's stamped as a music that kept me grounded even when I was away in San Antonio, in Texas, and in our community.
You represent a district that is, San Antonio is a big part of it. It's a big part of your life. What role do you feel like San Antonio plays in keeping the music alive? Kind of past its heyday of the 90s. It's still very, very big in San Antonio. And why is that?
Yeah, I mean, it's still huge. We've hosted the Tejano Music Awards for years here. You have Little Joey, La Familia, for example, just these groups that kept that music and kept that spirit alive. And it very much comes out of the place where I grew up on the west side, but also the south side of town. The neighborhoods that I grew up in were 90+% Mexican American and of different generations. You had folks like my grandmother that were immigrants, first generation, second generation, up to multiple generation of folks. And, and it just, they have kept that music and it's evolved over time. And San Antonio, I would say, along with a lot of places in South Texas, my wife's from the Rio Grande Valley. So, the Rio Grande Valley obviously has its own special history, but San Antonio has been one of the hubs for Tejano music. And, just like a very important place to celebrate it and to keep it going.
It strikes me. I think about Tejano music now, and I'm kind of digging back into the archives of it, and I think about like how much the state has changed and how much more prevalent the Tejano and Latino population is here. And I'm curious, like your mom was pretty active politically. How much has the experience of participating in politics as a Tejano in Texas changed, for you compared to what the experience was for your mom?
I mean, between she and I think it's been quite different. My mom was like the consummate outsider. She was in the Raza Unida party in Texas in the late 60s and early 70s. And this was a party that was formed around Mexican American representation and rights because the state was dominated at the time by the Democratic Party. But unfortunately, Mexican American concerns around the state had sometimes been left out of the party agenda. And so there was a third party that formed, but they were always outsiders. They were often, quite honestly, slandered for their work, even though all they were trying to do was run candidates and get people to vote. But, my experience has been as a representative serving in the state legislature and now in Congress going into my 7th term. So I've tried to figure out how I can work from the inside to change things and to make sure that this is a place of opportunity. This country and this state are places of opportunity for everyone. So those two experiences, I would say, have been fairly different. But I think it takes people both advocating on the outside, beating down the doors, as my mom says, but then ultimately, their goal was to help elect people who would be conscientious public servants and aware of the fact that a lot of our neighborhoods back then didn't have good schools, didn't have sidewalks on their roads, people didn't have health care, so they couldn't afford to see the doctor. All of these different real everyday concerns that people were dealing with, I feel like I have a chance now inside the chamber to actually take those on.
I know a lot of the older generation that grew up with Tejano music and were maybe more at that kind of adult age, in the 80s, 90s when it was really in its heyday, have shared some frustration about it coming off the radio and the changing dynamics of the type of music that's being played on the radio, like regional Mexican. And oftentimes I think people can kind of point to immigration and like even just the changing demographics within the Latino population in Texas as being part of that force, and so for you, what have you seen changing about like the sort of Latin identity in Texas, right? That to me, it felt like Chicano, Tejano, like very, very clearly defined as that culture for a long time. But I don't know that those terms are as widely used anymore. So what are you seeing change about the demographics here in that regard?
I mean, it's a great question. I remember like one of the sources of pride for me in that mid 90s period was they would rank the radio stations in San Antonio. And I remember, I want to say at least for a few years, the number one station in the city was the Tejano radio station. And I thought, man, how wonderful it is that you have so many folks that are listening to this music that is often bilingual. And it really is an incredible representation of our city. And then you started to see that popularity just wane. And I myself wondered, like, what happened? Like, where did it go? Or why did it become less popular? Or people weren't drawn to it as much? I do think that in Texas, you have a lot more of a diverse Latino population now. I mean, still overwhelmingly Mexican American, but you've got Puerto Ricans, you've got Salvadorans, particularly in Houston. You just have a whole range of folks whose origins are South and Central America who are also part of the Latino community. And I think it's been a great thing. And the music in its own way continues strong. In the last few years, we've seen like this real regional Mexican music, and Peso Pluma, who went to school in San Antonio for a few years, really become popular, not just in Texas, but throughout the world. And so I think all of those things are positive things.
After the election, people just seemed to be so shocked and thrown off by what played out in the Rio Grande Valley. And I kind of commented publicly that it was oversimplifying the Latino population to just assume that it votes or thinks one way. I mostly felt that way, that it was oversimplifying it because I can't get my entire family to agree on one particular thing, let alone, politics or anything else for that matter. Has that been your experience? Was the kind of changing of mindsets and the shifts politically something that was surprising to you?
I mean, like we've heard a million different explanations now about why you had a large percentage of Hispanics or Latinos in Texas over the last 8 years start to vote for Donald Trump, for example, or start to support Republican candidates in a way that they hadn't before. And so I don't know that my explanation is necessarily better than anyone else's. But I will say that the concerns of the community, I don't think have changed. It's still a community that is very much an aspirational community. For years, I spoke about making sure we build this infrastructure of opportunity of great schools and universities, a strong healthcare system, an economy that's built around well-paying jobs. And I feel like fundamentally, the Latino community in Texas still cares about making sure that that all those things are there, but also that their kids and grandkids are going to have a better chance in life than they had. That was my grandmother's wish for my mom and my mom's wish for me. And so regardless of the parties or the candidates, I do feel like that's the fundamental thing that people want. I also feel for a lot of people, when they see Donald Trump, people that are not following politics every minute of the day, or they don't have CNN or even Fox or MSNBC on television, they see a guy who is basically sticking the finger at the system. And a lot of our folks, they feel like the system has not worked for them. They feel like in ways they've been screwed by the system. And so, when they see a politician that they think is going against that system, that resonates with people. And like I've said for years, if you take South Texas, the Rio Grande Valley, even when Democrats were in charge, they didn't do justice to the Rio Grande Valley. They didn't build out the higher education infrastructure there. They didn't build out the road infrastructure. Still isn't a continuous highway that you can take from Austin or San Antonio without stopping in the small towns along the way to get to the Rio Grande Valley. That could have been done 50 years ago. And yet, here we are today and it still isn't complete. So there are real concerns that people had, along with the fact that grocery prices have gone up. They went up too high, too fast for a lot of people. So yeah, there are real concerns there that I think people have. And then don't get me wrong, I also think there's a lot of disinformation and misinformation and spin and all of that as well. But that's something that as Democrats, we're going to have to address and work out in the coming years.
This concept of just like the different channels and places people can look for information, or one of the things that I kind of point to as being a challenge for Tejano music is that a mixture of like radio stations just kind of deprogrammed it, and it's really not as prevalent as it used to be. And then on top of that, there's really no TV. But when you look at the Johnny Canales show in particular, he did such a great job of bringing together different types of music and making both the Mexican regional music, the norteño and conjunto, like feel right at home, right alongside the stuff that was very clearly defined as Tejano music. And so, what role do you think the sort of loss of Johnny Canales and that show played in Tejano and the shift of kind of prevalence that it's had over the last 15 to 20 years?
I mean, I think you're right. I mean, Johnny was like a kind of cultural guide for people, or kind of like cultural North Star for people that was helping to integrate all of these things. And, I feel sometimes like everything has become so dispersed, right? Like even in mainstream media, the channels that people are watching, or the streaming channels that they're watching, or even, you still have people, obviously people listening to terrestrial radio. Some people are listening to satellite radio, but a lot of people are in their own world with Spotify lists or Apple playlists. And so I think part of what's missing is somebody like Johnny that is bringing all of these things together and fusing them, and giving people some kind of direction, not like in a heavy-handed way, but just in a helpful cultural way, because these cultural issues, they do matter, and too often Latinos have not been represented and acknowledged for their contributions in music or film or other forms of art.
Well, and I know you've done some work with the Library of Congress. Can you talk a little bit about what you've done to help highlight Latino artists?
Yeah, I got involved about 5 years ago, right after what happened in El Paso, when that guy went and he ended up killing 23 people and injuring more than 20 others because he said that he considered them quote unquote Hispanic invaders to Texas. And I said, like, how does somebody come up with that idea if he didn't grow up in a community with immigrants, he didn't have a lot of experience with Latinos. And and there are a lot of different explanations, but I think one of the problems is that Latino contributions in art, science, business, government, a whole array of things, music, have not been properly acknowledged. And the Latino story has been left out of the telling of the larger American story. And so I really set out for the last 5 years in my own small way to try to help fill that void. And a few of the ways that I've tried to do that are by nominating our artists to the National Recording Registry, and then also our films to the National Film Registry that's handled by the National Film Preservation Board. And Latino artists in the Recording Registry make up, I think, like only 3 or 4% of artists whose albums or songs are acknowledged as culturally significant to the United States and to American culture. And, for a population that is almost 20% and growing very quickly, and a state in Texas where Latinos are a plurality and at about 40% of the population, it's amazing to me that there is so much unacknowledged greatness really about the contributions. And so the last few years, like, we've been submitting different artists' songs and music and film for acknowledgement. And when you get an honor, when you get an acknowledgement or an induction, one of your songs or albums into the Library of Congress's National Recording Registry, that honor is so great. It's the kind of thing that even the greatest artists, in their obituaries, it would say that they had X album or X song inducted into the National Recording Registry. That's how prestigious it is. And a lot of the artists that we've listened to over the years, I think, should be considered at least for inclusion.
Who on your staff do I need to email about getting the podcast nominated?
Yeah,
I just gotta wait till your interview comes out.
I know, right? It's got to be at least 10 years old though. So like,
oh, okay.
So all the Bad Bunny, like Carol G, Peso Pluma, everything that's popular now, it's still got a little ways to go. I think I want to say next year, for example, this is not Tejano, but Latino. Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton becomes eligible. The whole album, obviously. And so we'll be sure to nominate that one. But yeah, I mean, there's so many great Tejano singers over the years. We just nominated Ramon Ayala. We nominated Bobby Pulido, Selena, obviously. So like a lot of the different wonderful singers, because I think they deserve it. Pero yo no lo conozco. Pero yo no lo conozco. Pero yo no lo conozco. Su atrevimiento no tiene igual. Pero yo no lo conozco.
What's your reaction? I mean, I feel like I'm not hearing it as much because the election's over, but every election cycle, there's some famous artist who comes out in support or against somebody. And inherently, depending upon how people feel about that person's opinion, they tell them to shut up and sing. Should it be political? Is music political inherently? I mean, what's your stance?
Yeah, I mean, look, I've always been somebody who's appreciated people, artists using their platforms and their voices for good and to speak up. And, and so I appreciate it when they get involved in politics. I mean, they're Americans just like you and I and everybody else. So they have every right to lend their voice to a political candidate, or a movement. And there's a long history, as you know, going back decades and decades of musicians doing that. And how much it sways votes or, who's motivated by it or whatever, I think that's all debatable. But I think it's a positive thing. I think you want, as somebody in politics, I want people from different walks of life, not just people who are eggheads about politics, but people in business, people in arts and culture, also jumping in there and contributing their voice to what's going on in the country.
What's your, take on this use of the term Tejano? My mom used to be really, she did not like the term Chicano. My dad loves the term Chicano. I prefer Tejano. I don't really like Hispanic, right? Like there's all this nuance. Where do you fall in that camp? Like what do you define yourself as when people ask you, who you are and what to call you?
For me, like I'm pretty chill about it. Like I think I'm for whatever people want to be called. Growing up in San Antonio, it was weird because what I would usually hear was Hispanic. But with my mom and her friends who were involved in the Mexican-American Civil Rights Movement, they were always saying Chicano. So from them, I was hearing Chicano, and then just kind of growing up around everybody, it was Hispanic. And then I go to California for school, and now all of a sudden for college, and all of a sudden people were saying Latino. And for a little bit, I was like, wait, Latino, wait, what is that? And then, and now you continue to have debates about, hey, does that evolve into something else? But I mean, it is interesting. You're right that these debates over the name of the group, right? Like every few decades, it continues to come up, And I mean, the thing that we can't get to is like the debate over the name becomes a substitute for the actual progress and the advancement right, of the community. And sometimes you feel like you're debating over names so much that you start to forget, hey, there's actually things that we've got to work on here for the community. Like I said, like people, they want to make sure that they can build a good life in this country and that they can pass that good life on to their kids and grandkids. And, and I think that's true in San Antonio. It's true in South Texas and other parts of the state.
Yeah, I think the reason it's top of mind for me is because really even just this concept of what is or isn't Tejano music has been such a thing that has come up with almost everyone that I've interviewed. And I mean, the playlist that I listen to that I have in Apple Music or whatever, like it's a collection of music that I've just slowly pulled together over the years. And it never occurred to me that there was music in there that some people did not define as Tejano because I just play it because I like it. I just have Tejano. And And I've kind of used that term to more define like a feeling and like what I like.
Sure.
And right alongside them, now I have Grupo Frontera, I've got Fito Olivares, like I've got all this random stuff.
So it would be kind of like North Mexico to like South Texas or South Central Texas. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and like whatever charanga was, or like there are all these like random songs that would you define that as Tejano? No, but did they play at my cousin's quince? Yes. Okay, it goes on the playlist, right?
Cuando todos te olviden, volverás al camino donde yo me quedé.
Did you and your brother grow up speaking Spanish? Did your mom or your dad or stepdad teach you, or no?
My grandmother came from Coahuila when she was a young girl, and so she would speak to us in Spanish, and we would reply in English. And my mom did speak Spanish, but she was speaking to us in English, and so I wish that I had learned it better at the time than I did. I tell people I understand Spanish a lot better than I speak it, which is true. I can understand it pretty well. It's just like a lot of it is getting it out, right? But yeah, I mean, that's the experience I think for a lot of Mexican Americans. As opposed to my wife, like my wife, her parents were originally from Reynosa, and then she grew up in the Rio Grande Valley, and so she's like completely fluent in Spanish. San Antonio, it's interesting because I see it like when you look at the different cities, it's a overwhelmingly Hispanic city, like 65%, but it's also what is considered the most acculturated city of the different Hispanic cities. And one of those things, obviously, is for whatever reason they measure it, like the loss of language, the loss of Spanish, speaking Spanish. But no, I mean, so yeah, I understand it better than I speak it. I mean, I can speak some, but I've said I want to get fluent. Before I die, I promise I'll get fluent in Spanish so I can do all the interviews and stuff.
I know I've been in the same boat, and I mean it's surprised me how common it is. And what's funny is that I feel like that's increasingly, where I definitely felt like the minority within the minority, it feels more and more like it's a common experience, and that there are more people kind of coming of age, hitting this sort of midlife that had a similar experience in that way.
For 50 years, it was illegal to speak Spanish in school. And, my grandmother and my mom, when they went to school, even though my grandmother only went to elementary school, but if you spoke Spanish in school, you were punished. Like you were spanked, or they used a ruler on you. They basically, it was institutions that were basically beating a language out of a group of people, right? They were essentially asking you to drop that language. And so a lot of people didn't make it a priority to pass it on to their kids, in some ways out of a kind of self-preservation. And then also, in this country, over time, right, people have tended to blend into what is the mainstream, which is English language spoken everywhere. But yeah, I mean, there was a systematic effort to get people to drop Spanish, and there was a price for that.
It's funny you say that, because I think as I've talked to people, a lot of people feel like that's a unique experience to the Spanish language. And I years ago was photographing some people in Fredericksburg, and I found out that it was very similar for German children that spoke German still back in the 40s, 30s, and they were basically forced during World War II to stop speaking German. And it's why it's just not as prevalent, or as prevalent as, say, for example, Czech. And so it's an interesting commonality between German and Mexican people to have had this sort of washing away of some of the, immigrant culture in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I've been working on that for years, to highlight really the range of diversity in the state, the influence that different cultures have had in our state beyond the Latino community, right? Which in San Antonio, you can't really come to San Antonio without feeling that. But I mean, there's been influence by the Germans, the English, other Europeans, increasingly the Asian nations. And so, I think we ought to celebrate all of that and highlight all of it. I do think that it makes this state stronger.
I talk a lot about how nationally it feels like Dallas, Fort Worth, and Houston, well, and Austin too, kind of suck all the oxygen out of the room in some ways. But San Antonio is just cool without trying. Like it's a cool town. It's got such an incredible culture, but it's not going around and beating its chest about it. Like, what is that? It feels like y'all are just cool because y'all are cool.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is a very, like a very down to earth culture. And I do think that a lot of that comes from the Mexican American community, that oftentimes, like our parents and our grandparents, you had a lot of very humble, but very hardworking, earnest people, um, who, yeah, we're not like chest thumpers, but at the same time, we're very proud to be who they are and proud to be where they're from. And like if you watch the San Antonio Spurs, especially during that run of championships they had, right? Some people considered them boring, right? Because they weren't necessarily flashy, but they were very good at what they were doing. And they were absolutely winning championships without being like super braggadocious about it. But that's kind of, to me, like the spirit of San Antonio.
All right, that was my conversation with Joaquin Castro. Thanks so much to the congressman for joining me, and thanks to all of y'all for listening. I'll be back next week with an interview with the queen of conjunto music, Linda Escobar, who will talk about growing up playing music on the Caravan of Stars and why the whole world loves conjunto music. Adios. Viva Tejano is a Texas monthly podcast hosted by me, JV Sauceda. Our executive producer is Megan Kripe. The show is produced by Ella Kapakin and Patrick Michaels and produced and engineered by Brian Standiford. Additional production by Aisling Ayers. Consulting producer is Adrian Arredondo. A huge thanks to our partners, Mirna Perez and Adrian Arredondo, for access to the Johnny Canales Show archives. Keep an eye out for the upcoming documentary, Take It Away, which chronicles the rise and fall of Tejano Hollywood. Artwork is by Jen Hare Tompkins and Victoria Milner. Thank you all for listening. Adios. And remember, you don't need to wait for next week to hear the next episode. Get early access now by becoming a Texas Monthly audio subscriber at texasmonthly.com/audio.